Good morning, everyone. We're about 5 minutes out from the start time of our meeting. Good morning. Welcome to the Governor's Task Force on Student Debt. We'll begin in about 2 minutes as we have a lot of attendees starting to log in. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. This is Michelle Reinen from the Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection, your facilitator for the Governor's Task Force on Student Debt. And it is 10 o'clock, and so we will begin our meeting. We have a couple more members just logging in, but we will begin in the interest of time. And I turn the meeting over to the chair, Secretary Blumenfeld from the Department of Financial Institutions.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome back, everyone, to meeting number 4. I'm grateful to all of you for your contributions of your time and your talents as we move to the halfway point through this process of our meetings. Again, I know it would be great if we could all be meeting in person and building that rapport as we sat around a traditional conference table. Yet I'm impressed with the work that has gone on to date, and I know that we will be able to get to the finish line together virtually. So making the best of what we can do here. During today's meeting, we'll be hearing a power story from one of our fellow task force members. We'll be learning from experts in the field and saving a good chunk of time for open discussion. Again, trying to replicate what it would be like if we were meeting in person. We will also bring to you and share a more detailed process that we will use to arrive at our recommendations for Governor Evers, as well as an additional way for you to share your input on topics that we may not be able to cover during our sessions. Your voice is very important to us, and so we want to make sure that there are ample ways in which your voice is heard. If we move to the next slide, I just want to remind everyone, as we did in meeting 2, what does success look like at the end of our task force? And really laying it out here is being able to examine student debt from many angles and viewpoints, looking at it from a very diverse angles, and I think we're well on our way there. Hearing from all of our task members and seeking your input and ideas, researching the proposed solutions to address issues outlined in the executive order, and the executive order is quite expansive, as you all are aware, developing those sound recommendations for how Wisconsin can tackle its student debt problem, and producing a body of knowledge for Governor Evers and others to use and consider, as we know there's no magic bullet that one recommendation is going to solve this. It's got to come from many angles and many different approaches. So all recommendations will be put forward to the governor for consideration. We will go through that winnowing and process to produce what we think would be the most effective methods and recommendations for our state to employ. So with that, again, I just want to thank you. I think we're well on our way in terms of success. I appreciate all of you. And we've got an exciting meeting yet today, another one. And with that, I will turn it over to Michelle Reinen, our facilitator. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. And so as you can see, the agenda that was mentioned, we do have a couple of breaks slotted today, 8-minute breaks. So to keep everyone on their toes, but yet give you an opportunity to get stretched and refill your mug. And we will hear from our 3 different speakers, and then have that large chunk of time at the end of the meeting for our facilitated discussion. You receive those questions in your morning email, and they will be posted as well. So a little bit of time on each question, and then we'll go over those next steps again. And so with that, it is time for roll call. And we're getting really good and speedy at this, so fast that it's hard for me to keep up. But as a reminder, you'll chime in through the chat feature, which is through the WebEx. It's the cartoon bubble, if you will, chatting there. And you can close that when you're done with this if it's distracting to you during the speakers. But it is how we will take our questions today for the speakers. And we'll use this feature again when we get into the facilitated discussion. We will want to hear voices, but we'll use it as a means of trying to see who speaks next to just keep that a little organized. So with all that said, on to the roll call. With our chair having just spoken, we'll just go with the formal chat. She's already indicated that she's present. Ahead of me, excellent, Secretary Kathy Blumenfeld. Next, Derek Campbell. And then we have Connie Hutchinson. And if you don't have the chat feature, please do feel free to use your voice and unmute your microphone or your telephone if that's how you're participating today.
This is Connie. I'm here.
Great, thank you. Laura Sutherland. And then we have Kiona Jones.
Present.
Leah Thomas, thank you. And then Larry Graves. And Jeff Brandt. And Brandon Trujillo. And Rebecca Larson indicated she'll just be joining us a little late this morning. And for Representative Ballwig, we have Bethany Anderson. Thank you. And Representative Hesselbein. Senator Smith. Not yet, we'll check back. And then Shannon Holsey. And thank you, Mashud Akhtar. And then Kiamani Alford. And then Karen Bauer. Great, Jody Chung. Lucy Fensel. And then Renee Gosh. And Austin Hammond. Marisha Harris. Not yet today. All right. Renee Howard Paez. Thank you. And subbing in for Derek Kindle is Shane Maloney. Great. Paul Kundert. Kevin McShane. Jamie Miller. Michael Madursky. All right, Michael Rosen. All right, Alexandra Shade. Not yet. Sylvie Eisen. Great, Casey Wachniak. And I think I skipped Shannon Conlin in the list. But Shannon, I saw you earlier and I apologize if I went out of order and skipped that. All right, so that is everyone. Senator Smith will be joining us shortly. I saw that indication. So it looks like, and Kiona Jones, I saw your screen pop up, so it looks like you have joined us as well. And we are good for that portion of our meeting. Just again, a reminder that we will take our questions through this chat feature before we move into our speaker. But if the chat is distracting to you as we have our presentations, please feel free to close out that chat feature and just listen to the presentation and open it up. When we get to the question section, we will pause to make sure that questions are coming in and be responding to those. And if you are on the phone and unable to chat in, please use the Student Debt Task Force at dfi.wisconsin.gov email box. We do have someone monitoring that for member questions, and they will chat them in for you to be sure that we are able to ask those in the time that we have today. And so with that, I will turn the microphone back over to the secretary.
Great. And just a reminder too that we are recording the session today. So you'll see the little red dot. So this session, as all sessions have been and will be recorded. So just put that out there. It's my pleasure to introduce Karen Bauer, who is a member of our Student Debt Task Force and a consumer protection attorney at the Legal Aid Society of Milwaukee. Karen has been working on student debt issues for more than a decade. She's written articles on student loan repayment, and regularly trains other attorneys on ways to manage their educational debt. As a first-generation college student, Karen has personal experience with the challenges of navigating student loan repayment, owing more than $150,000 herself. Karen's firsthand knowledge of the difficulty in paying for her own education makes her particularly well suited to advise her clients and others on the issues. Karen holds a paralegal degree from the Milwaukee Area Technical College, a bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a law degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison as well. So it's great to have such expertise with us on the task force. And with that, Karen, I'll turn the show over to you today.
Thank you so much. Just need to get my PowerPoint up here. Can everybody see it?
Not just yet.
Uh-oh. Let me try again.
There, it looks like it's starting.
Okay. Good.
Here we go. Very
Perfect. So hi, I'm Karen Bauer, and I don't think I've ever shared this story with even my employer before about how I became a lawyer and my background. And I guess the secret's out at this point. So you can tell I'm a little bit nervous about this. I don't know why, but I just am. You know, real talk, we're all human beings. So I moved out of my parents' house right before my high school graduation for reasons that I won't go into here. And I was broke. I did end up signing up to go to college at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee almost immediately after high school, but I worked 2 to 3 jobs the entire time in order to try and pay for it. And because I worked 2 to 3 jobs the entire time, I didn't have great grades. I worked a third shift job at a gas station, and I worked during the day as both a bank teller and at Kmart to try and pay for my education. And the reason I needed to work so much is that my parents could not afford and would not cooperate to provide information for my FAFSA. And I couldn't be considered an independent student until I was 23. So I got 0 financial aid, no grants, no loans, nothing, which made it very, very difficult for me. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was that starting in law school, when the College Cost Reduction and Access Act was passed by George Bush, that's the act that provides us with public service loan forgiveness and income-driven repayment options that are many more than we had before. Out of pure self-interest, I started looking into those. So I kind of became the expert in my law school about those programs and started teaching classes to law students when I was in my 2nd year of law school. Despite that, and you can read a lot of that in my PowerPoint, I still had a lot of road bumps trying to get credits towards public service loan forgiveness. Sometimes people will use the wrong terminology. You're not in the public service loan forgiveness program. Public service loan forgiveness is something you earn credits towards. You need 120 monthly payments while in the correct payment plan, while working for the correct employer, and then while having the correct type of loans. I definitely had all 3 of those because, as I mentioned, I was kind of on top of this. But despite that, it's now June of 2020, and while one would expect I would get my loans forgiven in December of 2019, that simply wasn't the case. What happened? The Department of Education didn't issue the form that you would have to turn in to get your payments counted until January of 2012, 3 years after I graduated from law school. By the time I got a response, it took them 6 or 8 months to get back to me. There were some incorrect payments there. And because I'm an attorney, I was able to fight those. They put my loans into something called administrative forbearance each year while they were recertifying my income. And it turns out that even though I'd made payments, that forbearance meant that those payments didn't count. In order to get them counted, I had to go to my congressional delegation for help. And again, this is even though I'm an attorney who does student loan law. That's how onerous this process is. I finally submitted my public service loan forgiveness application. That's the final one about a month ago. And I've had to submit it 3 times. The first time my boss forgot to check a box. The second time I checked the box for her and it was rejected for that reason. My servicer never sent me anything about this. I had to call them to find out what was going on. This has repeatedly been an issue with my student loan servicer. There is incomplete information made available to borrowers, even though I check every single day because I'm waiting on $160,000 in student loan forgiveness. And my experience was more seamless than most. When you hear about a lot of people having problems with public service loan forgiveness or not having payments credited, it's because that form didn't come out until years after the program began. So that's an ongoing problem. The other issue that I've noticed personally is that the employees of student loan servicers vary widely in their competence, and their communications via mail are confusing. And to show you the amount of mail that I have received just in the past week, I have gotten about 15 pieces of mail this month regarding my application for forgiveness. And many of these mailings are contradictory and confusing, even for me. Because of my loans and my public service career, there have been some pluses and minuses. I, of course, was able to get my education, and I'm very grateful for that. I'm the first person in my family to go to college. And after I kind of broke that seal in my family, my sister also ended up getting a nursing degree after me. I love my work. My clients are amazing. However, because of this debt, I ended up buying a house very late in life. I was 43 years old and wouldn't have been able to do so without help from my in-laws. I also have really low retirement savings and a very low amount of emergency savings, which is a precarious financial position for an attorney. Every year I've lost money in tax deductions because I have to file my taxes married filing separately in order to keep my student loan payments at a reasonable amount. And the big one here is that I've been pretty risk adverse in my career. In order for me to switch jobs, I would have to make about $31,000 more than I do now, so that having to pay my full amount of student loans wouldn't cause me to lose money with a job switch. I've also been afraid to switch jobs so close to receiving public service loan forgiveness, so that when opportunities have arisen, I've been afraid to take them. Now I'd like to kind of switch gears and talk about my clients. All of my clients are below 125% of the federal poverty level. So for a single person, that means that they earn less than $1,600 a month. Many of them are elderly or disabled and receive Social Security income. For people who are disabled, there's something called a total and permanent disability discharge, but most of those clients don't know about that. 80% of my clients are African American or Latinx. Many of them are victims of for-profit colleges, and many of them, when they have a hard time paying, instead of going on to income-driven repayment, where they would have a zero payment, are told to just do a forbearance. The problem with that is that when you continually do forbearances, you're not earning any credits towards the 20 or 25-year forgiveness in many of the income-driven repayment plans. And then, of course, because my clients are low income, many of them are in default on their student loans. And the results of the student loan defaults, as we know, are wage garnishments and tax refund seizures. And an even bigger issue is that getting out of default is nearly impossible. What my clients would want us to tell you is that they are frequently encouraged to do forbearance when that's not the best result. And the reason for that, I know from my work, is that it's faster for the servicer's employee to get them off the phone. It might take an employee 15 minutes to get someone signed up for income-driven repayment, but a forbearance is a simple couple of buttons. And like me, my clients don't understand the mailings that they get from servicers. All of those mailings, for probably consistent messaging, are formatted similarly. And unless you read every single word twice, they're really difficult to understand. For my clients, they're impossible. Another thing that my clients would tell you is that they thought that they were doing something that would give them a leg up in life by enrolling in school. However, because of being victimized by for-profit colleges, many of those degrees are either useless or they were unable to complete them because of the high cost and huge amount of loans they were taking out compared to the potential salary that they would earn in those fields. My clients would also wonder why their servicer wasn't actually helping them. And with that, I would love to open it up to your questions about my experience. I'm an open book, so feel free to ask me anything.
Thank you so much, Karen, for sharing your story, and the task force members also extend that same question. Did you receive a letter annually showing the number of qualifying payments you have made? Also, were those number of payments showing up on the federal loan servicing website? And when you filed for forgiveness, did that total state 120 payments?
So in order to know how many payments count towards forgiveness, you have to send in that employment certification form every year. And once you send that in, they will look at whether or not you were employed in the right type of employer, whether you had the right type of loans, and whether or not you've worked according to the parameters of the program. And then they will respond, usually a month or two later, letting you know how many of your payments counted. That form is not required. And because of that, many borrowers don't send them in every year. They'll send them in every 2 years or when they change jobs. I sent my first one in March of 2012, and that's when I got my first response from my old servicer. And then usually upon receipt of that form, your loan will get transferred to Fed Loan Servicing because they are the official servicer for people who are trying to get public service loan forgiveness. So that document that you receive every year in response will state the number of payments that count. But unless you send the form in, you don't know.
Thank you. Our next question that came in is, did you talk with our elected officials and ask them about streamlining the process of forgiveness?
I have talked to every elected official we have about this program. And, part of those discussions were done in the context of me saying, help, they're not counting my payments. I don't know what else to do. But yes, I have talked to several of our state senators. I have talked to my state senator, Chris Larson, about this in the past. I have been banging the drum about this for years. And I'm also a member of a consumer organization called the National Association of Consumer Advocates. And that organization has been lobbying for changes in student loans and public service loan forgiveness in particular for a very long time. And the response I usually have gotten is, gosh, that sounds awful.
So another question is, what sources of information were most beneficial to you in self-educating about student loans?
So I have read every iteration of the governmentstudentaid.gov website, and there's another site through the National Association of Consumer Advocates called studentloanborrowerassistance.org.org. And that program gives, or that site gives some really common sense information in plainer language about the program. But for anyone who wants to get their loans forgiven, they can't rely, in my opinion, on representations from their servicer. They have to educate themselves.
And another question, can you tell the task force what relief, if any, have you been able to achieve for your clients who were enrolled in for-profit institutions?
So very frequently those clients have not graduated. And if they have, they're not working in the field that they were trying to get into because those for-profit schools were not accredited properly. And when they have tried to get a job, for instance, as a radiology technician or something in the health field, those employers won't hire them because they know that those schools did not provide a good education to those individuals. So overwhelmingly, those clients are working in lesser educated fields in the health area, like certified nursing assistants very frequently. So they are eligible for income-driven repayment. I'll put them into that. In some cases, if the school has gone out of business or closed, I can attempt to get them something called a closed school discharge. However, during the current administration, those applications have not been processed. So they have sat on them for years doing nothing about them.
So thanks for that. And then a couple more questions have come in. After having your loans transferred or consolidated with federal loan servicing, how helpful were they to you regarding the public service loan forgiveness process, since they are the only federal loan servicer for the program?
When I had payments that weren't counted, they weren't helpful at all. And the reason for that is that when my loans got transferred there, the records of the payments made before the transfer somehow got lost or were missing or were incomplete. And this is a very consistent problem that I see with attorneys that call me about this issue and other people that I provide advice to. The problem with this is, in my case, they actually retracted a previous employment certification that I'd supplied in 2012 and said they found an error in it. By the time they told me this, all of the records from my bank had already been disposed of, so I couldn't fight about that.
Wow. So there's a comment here that's in relation to the question before this last one, and it indicates that the member has seen the same problem associated with for-profit colleges. And the question is, do you have ideas on regulations that would protect student consumers?
During the last presidential administration, they were working on further regulation of for-profit colleges, but that work has since stopped. I think forcing those for-profit colleges to have standards is important, and also disclosing their employment numbers. You know, the percentage of people who are employed in their field after graduation at the time that people are enrolling is very important. That brings us to an important segue. And Michelle had mentioned that you usually ask about what, if I had a magic wand, what I would want. And I'm going to talk about those really quick. For me, for old me, for young me, actually, from 1989 to 1994, I would want more assistance for true independent students like I was. If I had financial aid back then, it wouldn't have taken me 14 years to get my bachelor's degree. I could have been working in public service much earlier. For me today, I would love incremental public service loan forgiveness for those of us working for a better Wisconsin, so that I wouldn't have to stay in a public service job for 10 years and give up all of those opportunities. And then for my clients and every Wisconsinite, I think we need a state ombudsman's office to provide individualized help to borrowers who have complex situations, or to fund legal services lawyers to do this work. And I think my time is up.
And that was an excellent way to wrap this up. Really appreciate that, Karen, and in the time that you took to share your story with us today. And so if there are additional questions that stand remaining, we will ask her to follow up and answer those as we have with other presenters here today. So again, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. And with that, I will turn the microphone back over to the secretary for our next speaker.
Great. Thank you, Karen, for sharing such a personal story. That took a lot of courage, and we really appreciate it because, again, it helps bring all the work that we're doing to life so that we can provide solutions, hopefully to help you somewhat, but also to help people. And I like how you're forward thinking and trying to help people down the road get into a situation that leads them to earlier economic success. So thank you very, very much for sharing. And with that, I'd also like to welcome Sarah Saddlemeyer, Project Director for the Student Borrower Success at the Pew Charitable Trust. One of the great things about having a virtual task force is the ability to get really the leading experts in the country from all over the country to join us so easily. And for that, I really thank you. Sarah directs the Pew Charitable Trust Student Borrower Success Project, including overseeing research advocacy, communications, and outreach. This initiative promotes successful repayment of student loans, especially among borrowers at greatest risk for delinquency and default. Previously, Sarah served on Pew's Financial Security and Mobility Project, assessing the relationship between short-term financial security and longer-term economic mobility. And on Pew's Economic Mobility Project, encouraging debate on how to improve opportunity in America. Before joining Pew, Sarah was a fellow at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families. She also worked for the Kaiser Family Foundation, the Urban Institute, the California Department of Health Care Services, and the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs. Today, Sarah will give us a consumer protection overview and her recommendations to our task force. Thank you, Sarah, for taking time to meet with us today. We're so happy you're here.
Thanks, I'm so glad to be here. Is the easiest way for me to share my screen with my slides for you all?
Yes.
Great. I have to admit that I'm a bit of a Luddite, and so part of what has been a silver lining of remote work is that I have gotten better at technology.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for your interest in our work and for that great introduction. I, as you mentioned, have been at Pew for about 7 years, and the focus of my work has been the health and status of families' balance sheets. And so the student loan project we launched in 2018 fits very squarely into that. Pew, for those of you who are not familiar, is a nonprofit that really focuses on bringing data to bear on some of the nation's most challenging public policy issues. And we also pride ourselves as a convener, bringing people together who might not normally be at the table together. So advocates in industry, Democrats and Republicans, to really try to find common ground and advance policy solutions. And that's very much sort of what we're doing today. The project on student borrower success is focused on the repayment and servicing space. So as opposed, and that's, fits very squarely with the mission of your task force, but as opposed to thinking about sort of why students have debt, we are a little bit agnostic. We certainly care, but sort of our project picks up and says, if someone has student debt, there should be a safe and affordable way to repay it. So we're focused on repayment and servicing. And we're also focused on borrowers who are most at risk of delinquency and default. And so as you mentioned, we do research, and I call little a advocacy, which is advocacy in, on behalf of our research. We think about solutions, we see what the data say, and then we bring those issues to policymakers. My work is right now exclusively focused at the federal level. So what I'll be talking about is our newest piece of research and some implications for federal policymakers during the pandemic and just sort of in general for struggling borrowers. But I think that allows us to have a conversation. You've had a bunch of people come to talk about what states can do and examples of what other states have done. And I think this will give us an opportunity to both talk about the relationship between the federal level and the state level, but also whether there's a role for states to play in federal advocacy, in trying to move some issues both at the state level and the federal level. And so I'll say, I can't actually see anyone when my screen's in share mode, so if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. I'm happy to take them throughout. Okay, so here we go. So during this briefing, I'm gonna give you an overview of the impact of the coronavirus and related federal legislation on student loan repayment, discuss the focus groups Pew recently conducted and our key findings, identify 5 solutions for federal policymakers, and then also highlight several longer-term considerations. And of course, I'm talking about these issues as impacting the federal level, but they really impact borrowers who live in states. And so there's a lot of different angles to approach this from. So I'm going to start with a broader view of student loans and COVID-19. The coronavirus pandemic and related economic downturn have really taken a significant toll on student loan borrowers and servicers. So for borrowers, many have lost their jobs, but for servicers, they also, they employ people, right? So those people may be sick, they may need to practice social distancing, they may not be able to work from home. So during a time at the beginning of the coronavirus crisis, when borrowers needed a lot of help, many servicers were experiencing, increased volume at the same time that they were having staffing shortages. So as you know, in March, Congress took a bipartisan action to mitigate the challenges facing these groups. The Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act, included provisions to pause payments and interest charges for most borrowers who are repaying their loans, suspend collection efforts for those in default, and these protections expire at the end of September. There have certainly been discussions and legislation to extend this, but this is where we stand right now. However, as I think you guys have probably been talking about, the difficulties that borrowers and servicers face are going to go beyond the end of these temporary provisions. And at that point, more than 26 million borrowers will re-enter repayment at the same time, and servicers will have to manage the overwhelming outreach from people who are back in repayment, trying to figure out their options, probably still experiencing financial insecurity. So this is set to be a pretty big moment in student loan repayment. And there are, this could be a problem, but there are also a lot of opportunities here. So during and after the pandemic, policymakers really need a clear understanding of the points within the repayment process where borrowers typically fall off track and actions they can take to promote successful repayment. And recently, Pew did focus group research that really, we hope, provides some of this insight. We conducted 16 groups with more than 150 borrowers. Sorry, I'm still caffeinating. Across 8 cities, which are listed here. The themes that I'll mention about are themes that occurred across all the groups, although of course there were some regional differences. And we heard 3 key things from borrowers. So first, financial insecurity drives repayment behavior. Income-driven repayment plans are difficult to access. And borrowers face challenges and confusion around transition points in the repayment system. And so I'll dig into each of these. So first, borrowers consistently reported that economic shocks, including job loss, unexpected health problems, and natural disasters were the biggest barriers to repayment. Borrowers were facing challenges then, and many are facing similar challenges today. Many said they wanted but were unable to make payments, and some even took out another job to make up the difference, which again is harder to do now. A Seattle borrower said, "The payments stopped because I didn't have work, and so I'm just trying to take care of myself in survival mode." And you might be thinking, okay, this is obvious, right? That like when people don't have money, they can't pay their bills. But this is traditionally, at least in the federal higher ed space, not the way we talk about and think about student loans. So I thought this was a really important point to bring forward. Second, income-driven repayment plans, which tie monthly payments to family sizes and income, were tough for borrowers to enroll in. And these plans are important because they're often more affordable, and there's a lot of research showing that when borrowers are in them, they're much less likely to default. But our focus group participants reported that, again, they're difficult to enroll in and to remain enrolled in. And part of that is due to the complex application and recertification process. And although recently passed late 2019 federal legislation does a lot to facilitate and make this process easier, that legislation has not been implemented yet. So we're still sort of where we were before the legislation was passed. And third, borrowers often said that they experience confusion managing the repayment process and were likely to fall off track during periods of transition. So such as when they're entering repayment, exiting periods of pause payment, or enrolling in IDR plans. And all of these things are about to happen, right? So this is about to be a giant moment of transition. So with millions of Americans experiencing pandemic-related economic shocks, and many more likely to do so in the coming months, Congress and the Department of Ed, as part of the next relief package or as part of various efforts, have a great opportunity to provide some targeted and timely support to borrowers. And the goal of these reforms should be to reduce barriers and confusion for borrowers, to address the needs of different kinds of borrowers. Not all borrowers are the same or having the same problems, and then to ensure ease of implementation for servicers. And I think that the servicer piece is something we don't always think about, but that when programs and policies are easy for servicers to implement, they are easy for them to give to borrowers, right? So I think this is, the ecosystem goes both ways, and really thinking about where's that sweet spot where borrowers can come out ahead. So we have, and are recommending 5 solutions, and I'll dig into each of these and then go talk a little bit about long-term considerations and then be done. So the first is to automatically extend deadlines for IDR plans. The second is to make it easier to enroll in and recertify for IDR. The third is to facilitate a robust outreach campaign. The fourth is to automatically allow additional pauses. And the fifth is to facilitate more uniform communication. So first, automatically extending deadlines for re-enrolling in IDR plans can help borrowers maintain their current payments. So for someone who is able to keep their job and is fine and go back or can go back to making their payments, that is something we can help with. And so the income and other data that people need to apply and recertify for these plans and calculate their monthly payments comes from tax information. And so extending the IDR deadline until after the next tax season will really allow those people to not be contacting servicers all the time, like immediately right after the pause payments end because they need help, but really allow servicers to focus in on those struggling most. So basically what we're saying is, for people who are fine, what are solutions to help facilitate their process so that servicers can pay attention to people who may be really struggling? The second is to make it easier to enroll in IDR. So in the last several months, millions of Americans have lost their jobs and will continue to do so and experience income volatility because of the economic downturn. And this means that the information on their taxes, if they've already filed, doesn't match their current income. And so if tax information is what you use to apply, their cycle is off, this is off. And so, the process for updating that information can be really time intensive for borrowers and servicers. It's a very, I think of it as like a touch heavy process, right? Paperwork has to be touched by someone and interpreted and processed. It's not automatic. And so to provide flexibility at a time of uncertainty, again, for those people who may have lost income, really allowing servicers to temporarily enroll borrowers into IDR plans without requiring extensive paperwork. So verbally, through a website, or through electronic communication in the short term. The third is to facilitate a robust outreach campaign. So borrowers who are struggling financially before the pandemic are likely to continue to do so, given the sharp increase in unemployment. Pew has done research over the last couple of years that really highlight indicators that can help identify at-risk borrowers before they're in distress. And so this includes missing payments early, repeatedly suspending payments, or having previously defaulted. The CARES Act does include outreach requirements for servicers. So as part of these initiatives or additional initiatives, they could use existing data to provide targeted assistance to borrowers who pre-pandemic were delinquent, were in hardship status, or paused payments repeatedly or for long periods. These borrowers may need additional assistance, including enrolling in IDR plans now and when the pause payment ends. And so this is important because, if you think to yourself, how do we identify a struggling borrower? Sometimes you have to wait until that borrower is struggling to say, oh, this borrower is struggling. And so these are sort of key places where we can encourage servicers to dig in that are predictive factors for someone who might struggle. And so that's why this is really important, is thinking about what past data can tell us about future decision making. So the fourth is to automatically allow additional pauses. So, we're thinking about this in a couple of ways, both helping people who miss payments immediately after the current protections expire to give servicers more time to reach them, especially if they're struggling, but also for those who may not be struggling but need to re-enroll in their automatic debit arrangements. Sometimes this can take time if it's not done automatically. And, a different way to think about this is instead of creating additional forbearances for folks, you could also think about suspending credit reporting for a couple months, right? Doing something that just gives people a little bit of grace, a grace period to go back into repayment. And finally, facilitate more uniform communications. The department should facilitate these communications, and it would help all borrowers, right? So our focus groups understand, our borrowers understood, and the groups underscored the importance of identifying promising methods for ensuring information delivered to borrowers is consistent, accurate, relevant, and timely. And that's especially true in a period of uncertainty. Importantly, standards for servicing should include a focus on borrower outcomes and not just process. So for example, reducing rates of delinquency and default, and requiring targeted outreach in periods of transition. Of course, the downturn alone did not cause the problems borrowers now face, which is something that we really need to remember. Before the pandemic, many families were already struggling with financial insecurity, and nearly 20% of the nation's 43 million federal borrowers were in default, and millions more were behind on their payments. So the policy recommendations that I suggested just now can not only assist borrowers during and immediately after the pandemic, but they can also address some longer term considerations that we identified in our focus group. So I want to do a time check. I'm happy to just spend 2 or 3 minutes running through the longer term considerations, or I'm happy for you guys to see them in my PowerPoint and to answer questions. What is the best, what would you prefer?
Sarah, you certainly have time to go through those longer term considerations. And then as you're doing so, task force members can certainly submit the questions that they have, and we should still have time for those questions as well.
Great. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say we have about 15 minutes left to process all of that.
Oh, perfect. Okay. I hate being the person that goes on too long and then there's no time for questions. So I always like to check.
We appreciate that. Thank you. Please proceed.
Yeah. So there are a couple of long-term considerations. I talked a lot about very immediate COVID-related issues and things to help borrowers in the short term. But there are also a lot of things that we've learned that are relevant for the longer term and might not be front of mind for policymakers, researchers, implementers, etc. So the first, many focus group borrowers indicated that they struggled early in repayment. The interaction between student loan payments and other expenses, such as childcare and transportation, was the primary factor in borrowers' choice of repayment plan rather than the specific choice of plan. So you're really getting people who are struggling and there's a lot of stuff in front of them and they're really wanting to pick the lowest choice option or the easiest option and just maybe don't have the bandwidth to think about or choose, to think about and compare the very intricate details of different plans, sort of regardless of their experiences with their servicers. And many borrowers had difficulty understanding all the options. So again, there's a lot of borrower things happening here and a lot of servicer things happening here, and often these things are mixed together and it's hard to untangle and think about where the reform needs to take place. A borrower from Phoenix noted that the student loan repayment system is not as user-friendly to find out what you're supposed to do. It's like so many steps and so much overwhelming information. Second, most borrowers reported pausing payments and doing so for far longer than they planned. I think our view, or I shouldn't speak for you, many people's view of how a successful repayer operates in the system is that they just put things on auto pay, they have a good job that has an increase in salary every year, and they're good, right? For 10 years on the standard plan or 20 years, 25 years on an IDR plan. But actually, our quantitative research also shows that a majority of borrowers, even those who are successfully paying down their debt, pause payments at some point in time. And this is important because we have this system that's designed to be very transactional, but people are needing a lot of things from the system, maybe some additional information, maybe a discussion of their options, and that isn't sort of at its core the way that the servicing system is designed. The borrower said that suspending their payments was easy and helpful in times of financial stress, and many chose this option over more complicated IDR options. And so, if someone is really stressed out and they really just need immediate relief, it doesn't take, I am not a behavioral economist, but it shouldn't take a behavioral economist to tell us that making the thing we want them to do the hardest thing to do is not going to generate the results we want, right? The thing that maybe we don't want them to do is the easiest thing, and the thing we do want them to do is the hardest. And so that's like an inherent built-in problem with this system. A borrower from Phoenix reported that he went to go to lunch like maybe 6 minutes away, literally, and by the time I got to the parking lot of Smashburger, I was already in deferment. And finally, increasing balances overwhelmed and discouraged borrowers. So having a growing balance as a result of interest accrual, capitalization, periods of pause or non-payment, or income-driven payments that didn't cover the interest that accrues on a loan created psychological and financial barriers to repayment for many. So, and in addition, many were discouraged by confusing repayment rules, unaffordable payments, inconsistent interactions with servicers, and impacts on other areas of their balance sheets. And this is where there's sort of a positive and negative that, I sort of don't immediately have a great answer for, and it's something that the field is thinking about. But, if we want to provide people with cheaper, more affordable options to repayment, that also means that many people are going to be negatively amortizing. And so this is sort of in tension. We saw it in tension with borrowers who wanted to be in IDR plans but were concerned about their balances growing. And, the eventual loan forgiveness in IDR plays a role here too, right? Is if that's a reality for people, are they conceptualizing that as a reality, right? Are they making choices with that in mind, or are they thinking more in the short term? So these are all sort of questions that I think are floating around a lot. Even those who were initially motivated to repay and had made payments and interacted with their servicers said failures of the system could chip away at their resolve. And so I just want to end on some key takeaways. I wouldn't be an effective advocate if I didn't say that things that are going on now to really deal with short-term challenges, we should assess what's working in terms of the reforms we're thinking about and what should maybe stick around for the long term. So thinking on, maintaining flexibility, reducing repayment complexity, and supporting at-risk borrowers when they re-enter repayment. What can we learn to sort of make sure some of these factors make it into longer-term reforms? It's important to not only address current needs, but to think about how the repayment system, how we can reboot it. And we can start both, again, putting those pieces in place now to reboot the system and make it ready for borrowers to re-enter, but also think about long-term solutions. And finally, and I sort of have been talking about this all along, again, just to reiterate for the 1000th time, thinking about longer-term structural changes. So as we do Q&A, I'll just leave. I attended this fantastic workshop on how to not give really boring and terrible presentations. And the thing that I really took away from that is ending on the thing that you want people to keep looking at while you're doing Q&A is important. So this is my pilot study of that, keeping this up. So thanks so much. I'm happy to chat about this, about other things, answer your questions, whatever is most helpful to you.
Well, we appreciate being the pilot, especially with 5 solutions right in front of the task force members for consideration. So I'm going to start with the second question we received, just given the time of it, and that is, what role do you think states can play in this space to facilitate softer landings on October 1 when the CARES forbearance ends?
That's a really great question. I think there's a lot of things states can do, and I'll start this by saying I'm not a state policy expert. So I think there are sort of a couple buckets of what people can do. There are existing state programs. So many states have student loan ombudsman or people who otherwise through the executive branch or, otherwise interact with borrowers, really ensuring that there's an information campaign there. But also trying to get people into income-driven repayment plans, right? If this is going to be a complex undertaking, we can start it now, right? The people who are in IDR plans also have their payments paused. So getting people into these like really beneficial programs is something that I know we can never have too many folks focused on. I'll also say that some of the larger changes in terms of things that are potentially going to be included in future legislative packages, having states and folks from, state government and elsewhere weigh in at the federal level means a lot. When we are on the Hill talking to Congress people, it's someone from their state. So if a state legislator, a university president, someone who, has been influential weighs in, it's a lot easier for us to push some of these things because people feel like there's a lot of momentum behind them. So I think there's both things to do at the state level, but also things that states can do in terms of federal advocacy.
Okay, thank you for that. This is a long one, but at the end, they want you to share your professional opinion on this situation. So many in the financial aid community have long advocated for all students to be put into an IBR plan as a standard plan that all students should go into upon starting repayment. And then students could shift to other repayment plans if that suited their situation. And an example is starting them in a program more likely to work for all, and then allowing them to shift to an option with less interest or shorter repayment if their situation allowed. So this would, in theory, remove much of the complexity within the current application processes to get into an IBR program or staying on track within the program. Because it would become the default program and the federal government has access to all income information without an individual providing it via the tax system, so it should not be as difficult as it is today. The person knows this would be a federal solution, not a state solution. And there, could you share your professional opinion on that?
Yeah, that was actually an excellent question. And I think it is there are a couple things at play here. So I will say first, the federal government sharing individual borrowers' tax information or income information with the Department of Ed is a very heavy lift. There is a piece of legislation that I mentioned that was passed last year that directs the IRS to share this information with the Department of Education. And the level of data security and interagency agreements and sort of all of the pieces that are in play there is so large that this is going to take a really long time to be implemented and be a huge lift. So while I would like for that to be an easy process, it's not. And so until that is in place and until we have a solution, borrowers would still have to provide their income information, and that's often what is difficult for servicers to obtain. The second is, I think it depends on which IDR plan people are being opted into. IDR is a great solution, but not for everyone, right? So for some people may want to pay down their loans faster, may not want to be negatively amortizing, right? And so sort of my thought about this is I have never met a borrower who has problems getting into forbearance. Right? It's really easy. You can do it over the phone. You can do it right then and there. It's not a big deal. So sort of once this income information situation is sorted out, we should just be making IDR plans as easy to get into as forbearance, right? If this good beneficial solution was easy to get into, I have no doubt that people would not struggle to enroll. And I think that also sort of leaves some of the not turning servicers or financial aid advisors into people who are sort of really having to counsel people through a bunch of like pretty private financial decisions. Thinking sort of about all of those three pieces. So the key, the holy grail here is the data sharing, and we're working on it. It's really tough.
And then this will probably be our final question. And after that, I'll ask you to, any last thoughts that you have for sharing with the task force members. But the question is, when the mortgage industry crumbled in 2009, the federal government financially incentivized the servicers to enter into mortgage modifications. Can we financially incentivize the servicers to help guide borrowers to the IDR plan that best serves them? The members that I've dealt with servicers before, and they are friendly and helpful, but you need to ask for all you get instead of the servicers offering choices for best solutions.
That's a great question. And so the way that the servicing system is designed now, we are not incentivizing or paying servicers for the things that have been discussed in these meetings about things you want them to do. Right. And so I am not, certainly not everything is perfect, but an important part of the conversation that isn't discussed enough is that servicers are paid to keep borrowers in on-time statuses. And as borrowers get more and more and more delinquent, they get paid less and less and less. So for people who need the most help, could most benefit from an IDR plan, servicers are paid the least. So thinking about not just, reforms in terms of the consumer financial protection, which is incredibly important. And I know the previous speaker spoke about this, so I won't go into that, like taken as a given that that's really important. Also redesigning the contracts we have with servicers and the relationship where we're saying, we will pay you for the outcomes we want. So servicers aren't necessarily paid more to get people into IDR plans. Right. So if we want them to do that, we should be shifting the financial incentives we have to push that forward. And so again, I'm not saying that there's not a role for consumer financial protection, but I think these things have to exist together. We have to make sure that servicers are, like all industry, like doing the things we want them to be doing and the things they're supposed to be doing and pushing for borrowers to have good outcomes, but we also need to design contracts where that's what we pay for, right? And so a mortgage servicer is paid, I'm probably going to get this slightly wrong, but like somewhere between like $10 and $20 to do per interaction to do that. servicers are paid at most $2.85 a month for borrowers. So I think also the level of, I think there's just like different financial incentives in play. And so thinking about how much we pay and what we pay for is equally important as holding people accountable for promoting positive borrower outcomes.
Well, thank you very much for your time and your knowledge and sharing it with our task force today. Any final thoughts in our last minute before we go to our break?
Yeah, I'm happy for anyone to reach out if they have questions. I think, I believe the previous speaker's name was Karen. I think I caught the end of her presentation. I think our presentations are really two sides of the same coin and sort of look at from a larger perspective and from a personal perspective. And so I think there's a lot of places where I'm happy to chat, and I'm sure she is too, about sort of painting the larger picture in terms of what individual states and the federal government can do. So I think this was a great pairing. And I'm really excited to hear from you guys if you have more questions.
Well, great. If more questions come in, we certainly will send them your way so we can get answers back for the full task force. And again, thank you very much for your time and your expertise in sharing with us today. And with that, we will go to our break and come back at 11:13. 11:13 for introduction of our next presenter here today. So we will put everyone on mute and proceed to our break. Thank you. We are 1 minute before we will come back from our break. All right, if everyone could come back from break at this point, we will proceed with an introduction of our next speaker.
Great, thank you. Welcome back, everyone. This 8 minutes goes by very quick, doesn't it? So I have the pleasure today of introducing Joe Sanders. Joe is the supervising attorney for the Consumer Fraud Bureau of the Illinois Attorney General's Office and the first student loan ombudsman for the state of Illinois. Joe's practice focuses on post-secondary education and student lending and includes litigation against for-profit schools, student loan servicers, and the U.S. Department of Education, as well as education policy work at the state and federal level. Joe is also the co-author of multiple articles on student lending. Prior to his work at the Illinois Attorney General, Joe was the director of predatory lending litigation project for the Legal Services of New York City and formerly served as the chair of Chicago Bar Association's Consumer Law Committee. Today, Joe will give us an overview of the student loan ombudsman position, as well as his recommendation. Joe, thanks for taking time to be with us today. We're delighted to hear from you.
Then we'll take questions.
Joe, you cut out at the very beginning, so welcome. We can hear you now.
Oh, okay, good. Okay. Hi, I'm Joe. I'm glad to be here. I'm the student loan ombudsman for the state of Illinois. I have to give my disclaimer that the views I'm giving here are my own and don't represent the official view of the Illinois Attorney General's office. I'm going to give people an overview, a very high-level overview of state student loan servicing laws and the components of those, bills of rights, state licensure, and of course, student loan ombudspeople.
Hey, Joe, before you go much further, I think your PowerPoint isn't in full presentation mode. It's in preview mode.
Okay, so you're seeing the presenter view, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, 1 second. Okay. Bear with me.
Joe, you can swap it by hitting display settings and then at the very top left. And then under that, there should be swap presenter view. There you are. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, do we have it now?
Yes.
Okay, is everyone seeing the regular view now?
Yeah, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. So let's get to it. I think it's important to start when we're thinking about state regulation of student loan servicers to think through what is a student loan servicer. It seems like a basic question, but important to consider when you're thinking through the state's role here. So this comes straight from the U.S. Department of Education's website. A loan servicer is a company that handles the billing and other services on your federal student loan. The loan servicer will work with you on repayment plans, consolidation, and assist you with other tasks related to your federal student loan. It's important to maintain contact with your servicer And if your circumstances change at any time, your servicer will be able to help. So the department is telling people this is somebody who helps manage your loan on a day-to-day basis. And so that's sort of how, you know, we should think about servicers as we go forward. What states have these state student loan servicing laws? These are relatively new laws. So we've got a list here of states that have passed them: California, Colorado, Connecticut, DC, several others. There's also a bunch of states that have these laws pending. And because of disruptions in the legislature, you know, we may have had more states that had passed laws this year, but Arizona, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Oregon, South Carolina have proposed bills. I may have missed some here because there's a lot of action each year on these bills. And it's important to remember that these bills differ by state. So some require licensure of servicers, some don't. Some have student loan bills of rights that are essentially rights for borrowers, some don't. And some create student loan advocates or ombudspeople, and some don't. What I'm going to do today is I'm just going to use Illinois' bill as sort of a high-level overview to look at each of those three pieces, because we have all three pieces. We have a student loan bill of rights, we have a student loan ombudsman, and we require licensure. And then we'll look at, very briefly at the end, areas where other states have done things a little bit differently, or where there's some shared pieces, and we'll look at some litigation that's affecting how Wisconsin should think about these bills as it goes forward. Okay, student loan bill of rights. Now there's a lot of stuff in Illinois' bill, but I've provided some highlights here that I think, you know, would be important for the task force to consider. Provide prompt and accurate handling of payments. This primarily comes into play where somebody wants to make more than their regular payment or direct what loans an overpayment should go to, and servicers can sometimes have problems with that. Our bill requires servicers to train personnel on repayment plans so that if someone calls up and needs help, as the Department of Education is sort of directing people to do, and as servicers do themselves, the servicers have the personnel who know the ins and outs of these things. Struggling borrowers have to be routed to a repayment specialist, somebody who knows the repayment plans. And servicers have to assess borrowers' financial situations to determine if alternative repayment options are available. In addition to the requirements on the servicers, borrowers also get some specific rights in our bill: free payment history on request, and a right to a timely dispute resolution and appeal. Again, there's more in the bill. I did send that on last week, so it should be in your background materials for this session. The student loan ombudsman. We created an ombudsman. What does the ombudsman do? So first of all, attempt to resolve borrower complaints against servicers, schools, and other student lending participants. So oftentimes when consumers complain to us, it's not just about their servicer. It might be about their school. It might be about a scam where someone's offered them relief and they've paid money to try and get that relief. So our bill makes explicit that these complaints are about more than just servicers. It's really about financing of post-secondary education, and I think that's a good perspective to be in. You need to look at the whole ecosystem. Compile and analyze complaint data. In our first year up and running, which was 2019, we revamped how we code these, and it's going to give us a lot more granular look into the specifics of these complaints. And then provide information to the public agencies and legislatures on student lending problems and recommend solutions. This year in 2020, we've done that. We ran a couple bills. Unfortunately, given the limited time our legislature's been in session, it's unlikely that either will pass this year, but you know, we're looking at information on private loans versus federal loans, and we're looking at student loan debt relief scams here in Illinois. So we've already drawn some conclusions from our 2019 complaints and are offering some solutions. Student loan servicers have to be licensed in Illinois. Now, what a student loan servicer is defined by our act, and so there's a lot of ins and outs in that, but some of the exceptions are banks, guarantee agencies, and schools are exempt from licensing. There are approximately 30 student loan servicers that are currently licensed in Illinois. Servicers and our Department of Financial and Professional Regulation use the nationwide mortgage licensing system, NMLS, to post reports, applications, and get other requested information. And the Secretary of Financial and Professional Regulation can levy fines against servicers, examine books and records of servicers, issue subpoenas, and investigate complaints, among other powers. Again, there's a lot in the bill there. I'm happy to take questions, but the bill should be in your background material, so you can take a look through everything there. Okay, very important to think about some of the litigation around these laws, and sort of the case to start with is SALSA versus DC. SALSA is the Student Loan Servicing Alliance, it's the trade group for servicers. It's a very good opinion to read through because I think the judge did a very thorough job in working through all the preemption arguments and all the arguments, otherwise constitutional arguments that the servicers put forward as to why DC's law should be stricken. Where the court came down was on something called obstacle preemption, which is a piece of conflict preemption. And they said that states can't second guess the federal government's choice of contractor, so that, and I'm paraphrasing here, I'm not going to get this exactly right, but that if DC had decided to revoke a servicer's license, it would effectively be second guessing the contractor that the federal government had chose. Again, case is definitely worth a read if you're considering a student loan servicing law in Wisconsin. Another one that we should consider, and then we'll look at how states have dealt with some of this, Nelson versus Great Lakes. This one is really about the issue with Section 1098G. It's not so much about the specific litigation. But Great Lakes asserted, and other servicers often assert, that borrower claims against them are preempted by Section 1098G of the Higher Education Act, which states that federal student loans, quote, shall not be subject to any disclosure requirements of any state law, end quote. Now, the claim in Great Lakes was that the student said, the servicer held themselves out as working on my behalf. I called them, and then they put me directly into a forbearance when I would have been better off in an income-driven repayment plan. And again, I'm paraphrasing the claim there. There's more detail in the case. But the Seventh Circuit, which would be obviously relevant for Wisconsin, held that imposing liability for voluntary but deceptive statements doesn't impose additional disclosure requirements on Great Lakes. So the court goes in, they look at the types of disclosures that the federal government requires, and then they say, that's not what is going on here. This is not something where the federal government requires it and the state's trying to tell them to do it different. This is a deception claim, and the court allowed the borrower's claims to go forward. Important to think through Section 1098G, though. to the extent that you're designing a state student loan servicing law. Okay, a couple highlights from other states and how they've dealt with some of these issues. So Colorado's law passed after the SALSA decision, and Colorado provides an automatic license for servicers that are servicing on behalf of the federal government, right? So if the federal government contracts a servicer to service federal student loans, they automatically have a license in Colorado. And New Jersey, whose law passed around the same time, has a similar provision to that. And the thought is that that gets around the preemption issue that was raised in SALSA versus DC. Similar to Illinois, Colorado statute requires services to analyze borrowers for alternative repayment options. New Jersey and Maine have similar provisions. And I think that this language is interesting because, you know, the verbs that they're using there, analyze, assess, you know, you can go into each statute and see exactly what it is. But it's not saying, it's not a disclosure, right? They're not saying you, servicer, have to tell student X, Y, Z. They're saying you have to like analyze them. You have to think through their financial situation. Okay, finally, I want to finish up with Fiha versus Connecticut. This case just came down end of April. It's an important one to think through if you're thinking about a state student loan servicing law. Connecticut ordered Fiha to provide documents about the public service loan forgiveness. It's a federal program that provides what it says, forgiveness of loans for public servants, but it is not operating very well. We're talking about like 1% of people have been, 1% of applicants have been approved. So not operating well at all. Connecticut wanted to know more. The department told Fiha not to provide the information because the department interpreted the Privacy Act to preclude production. You know, you can differ with the department's interpretation there, but that's what the department said. And the court, and again, I'm paraphrasing here, this is a long decision, so it's worth a read, but the court held that Connecticut's law was conflict preempted because Fiha couldn't comply with what the feds wanted to do and Connecticut wanted them to do. And I've got a pin site there that's a good place to pick up that argument. Another case to watch, California's banking regulator recently sued Fiha for failing to provide Teach Grant information. Another program to provide financing that's not strictly a loan. And Fiha has put up a similar defense for California. I think that motion is still pending, but if you I think it's on the banking regulator's site, their complaint. So that's another one to watch. And I think I'm going to stop there and see if we have questions. But that's the 50,000-foot overview and some issues to watch for.
We do have a few questions, and it goes back to when you were explaining the law. So who appoints the ombudsman and who do they report to? And then are there protections that ensure the ombudsman is independent to guard against political influence?
Great questions. So each state has done this differently. So there are states that have put them in their higher education regulator. There are states that have put them in their banking regulator. There are states that have put them in their attorney's general office. And so, you know, I think it's worth thinking through what works best for your state system. I can speak to Illinois. One, in our law, it specifies that the ombudsman will be housed within the Attorney General's office. We have in the Attorney General's office a consumer protection division, which within that division there are different bureaus. So there's our charitable bureau, which registers charities. There's our medical bureau, which deals with insurance issues. There's our consumer fraud bureau, which is the enforcement arm for our state Consumer Fraud Act, among others. We chose to house the ombudsman in the Consumer Protection Division. And we did this because we felt that there needed to be some separation between enforcement and the education role that the ombudsman engages in. So although I wear two hats, there's a team of people that are in the Consumer Protection Division that are our citizens mediators, citizens advocates, excuse me. They mediate consumer complaints. That's the bulk of us trying to resolve these complaints. And, you know, I think that the ombudsman can be structured in a number of different ways. Again, you could put it in a different agency. You could place it in a different place within that agency. But I think that the most important thing about having an ombudsman is to have a resource for borrowers to go to where they can get impartial information. And with such a complex landscape out there, I think that it is worthwhile for a state to create one of these positions. We have a student loan helpline that students can call. We have an email address they can email into, and they can file through our consumer complaint system. We've also started a series of outreaches. We started with public service loan forgiveness because of the problems with that program here. But we are, although COVID delayed, rolling out some more general programs that we're going to be presenting virtually, which may actually help us reach more people. So we're hopeful going forward.
So I feel
Other
like you were,
questions?
oh, sorry. I feel like you were headed towards answering this question, but didn't get there all the way. How are the services of the Ombudsman's office publicized to the public? Are the servicers required to tell borrowers about the existence of your office? And the reason why this is being asked is because of when there was a stronger federal ombudsman, most borrowers didn't know about the possibility of getting help from them. And I know you were just talking about your hotline and outreach, but can you explain how it's publicized to the public?
Yeah, that's a great question. In Illinois, we have the Attorney General's office, and that's why I think the Ombudsman was housed here. We have a long track record of working with issues in higher education. Started with investigations into for-profit schools after the last economic downturn. We built on that and looked at a lot of issues with servicers. And so we have sort of an established position as a resource to go to for these issues. Now, that being said, I think that we should be doing more promotion, and I think that it is something that is a goal for me going forward, and I think that it's something that if you're starting from a different position where you're not necessarily going to have an office known for doing this work, that should be built into a plan up front. So very good question, definitely something to think about.
And another question in the same area is, how difficult was it for the state to pass these laws, and did these legislative measures receive bipartisan support?
They did receive bipartisan support. Our bill was one of the first, so you know, I think the experience may differ now. Our office helped draft the bill. We got a sponsor in the Senate who was a great partner. It passed, and I believe the initial vote was narrowly bipartisan. And the servicers were not particularly engaged in our process, somewhat to our surprise. There wasn't a lot of back and forth on the language of the bill. Our governor at the time vetoed the bill, and in veto session, his veto was overturned, and it was overturned on a broadly bipartisan basis. So we actually got much more support from both sides of the aisle on the veto override vote. Now, that being said, I think talk to Colorado, talk to New Jersey, talk to Maine. Theirs were passed much closer in time to where we are now, so they may have more insights. And obviously, every state is different. So, but ours did get bipartisan support.
Thank you for that. You indicated in the Borrower Bill of Rights, there is a requirement struggling borrowers are routed to a specialist by the servicer and a more thorough review of the financial situation is analyzed. Does that mean that non-student related finances are considered? If so, what protocols are in place to ensure these specialists are qualified to provide more expansive financial advice?
Great question. So the short answer here is that on the federal student loan side, what you're really going to be talking about is the difference between a short-term solution like a forbearance or deferment and a longer-term solution like income-driven repayment. Servicers know how to do the income-driven repayment analysis. It does require input from the borrowers, so I think the speaker before me was talking about difficulties getting documents from people, and so that's part of that process. But what you're going to collect is pretty well defined, and then the formula for once you've got somebody's adjusted gross income, how you get to what their payment is going to be is pretty well defined. I think the more interesting question there is on the private student loan side. And private student loans have far fewer alternative repayment options for borrowers. And our law also has some provisions that require alternative repayment options to be sort of across the board on the private student loan side. So you can't the idea is that students are getting something that's uniform and not just sort of sui generis, who calls up and who gets what operator or something else random. So I think the question is even more interesting when you start to think about the private student loan side. There, it's less defined what they're going to look at. It's less defined what the options are, and so I think that's an area where there's a lot of work to be done, particularly as we start to see the private market come up with products that are touted as a cure-all, but really need more analysis. So something like an income share agreement, provisions around private student loans and how alternative repayment interacts with them. That's an interesting space going forward.
This question goes back to the organization and the structure. How big is your organization?
The Attorney General's office is very large, but I'll drill down and just talk about who we have working on the student loan ombudsman side. So there's myself, and I split time between the Consumer Fraud Bureau and the Consumer Protection Division in the ombudsman role. We have a team of 5 citizens advocates when we're fully staffed. I think we have 4 right now, and we're going to be putting someone into the 5th spot that are trained on student lending issues and that help me with all the complaints that we get. So for example, right before I got on this call, I had my weekly call with that team. And we have 2 or 3 other attorneys that work with these issues that are on those calls. We talk about specific complaints. We talk about developments that have gone on in that week, things that might come up on our helpline. So that is the rough working group. We've got me, we've got the 5 advocates, and the advocates split their time too. They're not just doing student lending complaints, but they are dedicated to that team. So our advocates will deal with all consumer issues that come in the door, but then we have each advocate gets trained on 2 subject matter areas, right? So you might have somebody who does home repair and auto. You might have somebody who does student loans and mortgage loans. And so that student loan team, those advocates are key to our ability to process all the complaints that we get. And the other attorneys that work on student lending issues are key to allow us to do more trainings. So I'll develop a training, I'll give a training, right, to the public, you know, work through the issues there, and then I have another set of attorneys that I can go to say, okay, you know, this one's ready to go. You know, Greg, you can go do this one in Rockford next week or whatever it is. So it's definitely a collaborative effort here in our office.
Well, thank you for taking the time to answer all of our questions. And in the final minute, any final thoughts or information you'd like to leave with the task force members?
I'd just like to say that I'm really glad that everyone's doing this deep dive, and I would love to continue to be a resource. So please let me know how else I can help, and best of luck with this important work.
Well, again, thank you very much for your time today and sharing your information and insights into the program as the task force proceeds. So again, thank you.
Thanks so much.
At this time, I will turn it back over to the chair, Secretary Blumenfeld.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Joe, for all the work you're doing in Illinois. And I know you're a leader in the nation and work with ombudsmen across the country and share best practices. So you've been really helpful to us and appreciate your time today. So thank you. And we will take you up on your offer to stay connected. Absolutely. So at this point, I just wanted to, we've talked about our process. I wanted to take it down another 10,000 feet just to be transparent and kind of share with you. If you think about being at a mall and looking at the map and it says you are here, today we are at meeting number 4, the first one on the left here, and just wanted to walk you through the process that we intend to take to get us to our final recommendations for the governor at the end of our meeting 8. And it's going to take all of us and a lot of cooperation to get through this, but I am confident that we can do it and do it really well. So today we're sharing obviously the process, and we want to make sure, again, doing this virtually, that people have a chance to really roll up their sleeves and do a deeper dive into areas that they're very passionate about and that you have expertise. That's why we have you on this task force, and make sure that you have multitudes of opportunity to provide your input. So following today's meeting, we are going to send you out a quick survey. It should take less than probably 3 minutes to complete. It'll have 2 questions, really. We have taken all the kind of recommendations, the proposals that we've heard to date, and we've put them into 3 different buckets. And I'm going to share that with you in just a moment here. And what we would like you to do is to let us know which work group that you're most passionate about. So ranking them 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. and we will do our darndest to get you into the bucket that you have the most passion about. And if we have way too many people in one bucket, we may have to go to your number 2. But ultimately, at the end, you'll have input into all recommendations. So let me assure you that. And then we're also going to ask you for your recommendations. So obviously, there's a finite amount of airtime that we have within our meetings, and there may be ideas that you have in your head that we haven't captured to date. And so if that is the case, or even if we have captured it, but you have maybe a different flavor, a different angle on it, we really want you to have the ability to provide your recommendations. So if you have the intent to do that, we're going to ask you in the survey tomorrow to let us know the topic that you will be proposing. You don't have to write the proposal by tomorrow, after tomorrow's survey, but we ask you to let us know of your intent to write one. And so we're asking that that survey be turned around by July 1st. So you have a few days to think about it and to look at the ones that we've already captured. And then during meeting 5, which will be on July 8th, we'll be dividing into those 3 work groups. So we'll take your responses from the survey, we'll divide our task force into 3 working groups. We'll have a couple presentations during that meeting, and then we will break into the 3 groups, and you'll have a chance to do a deeper dive within the initiatives that are within proposed recommendations that are within your work group, and we'll spend meeting number 5. We'd like to then get all of the proposed solutions, and we're going to give you a template to use so that you know exactly what to do. And it should be about 1 page. So we're not asking you to do a super heavy lift. Might bleed into 2 pages, that's okay. But you might reference other research or other, even back to some of the research that we've provided, if that's helpful for your presentation. But we'd like to keep it at a high enough level that the task force can look at all of these proposed recommendations as we narrow into the prioritization process. So we'd say the absolute last day that we could receive those recommendations would be July 14th. We'd love to have them sooner because the sooner we have them, for example, if we have them way before our meeting 5, we can actually build those into the 3 work groups. But the last day, just given kind of the process, would be July 14th when we'd like to receive those proposed solution summaries. Then we'll move into meeting 6. We will have a couple presentations still at that meeting, but the balance of it will be really be spent again in our work groups and looking at those and trying to prioritize the initiatives within your work group so that during meeting 7, we can have a readout from the work groups and present those to the full group. So we'll be back together as a whole group in meeting 7 and going through an ultimate prioritization process at the full group level. So we'll base it on the work groups proposals, but you'll also, if you were in one group and you're passionate about an initiative in another work group, you'll absolutely have that time to be able to provide your input. And there are other mechanisms we'll give you also to comment on the initiatives along the way. And then between 7 and 8, we will take all of the initiatives and we will put them into the proposed final report with all the final, again, we're going to deliver the entire body to the governor, but we will prioritize the initiatives based on what the full task force says are the most important ones and the most, I guess, realistic ones for us to move forward in our final report. So each initiative will have a 1 or 2 page kind of proposed solution for everyone to look at. And that will help, since we'll probably have 20 to 30 of these different initiatives. We didn't want to do, 20-page papers on each one because it would be probably more than any one person could get their arms around. So we're trying to find that balance of giving a good overview and enough for the governor to say, hey, that's a great idea. I'm going to move that forward. And then ultimately the devil's in the detail in terms of, how that all gets, done down the road. But giving enough information in the governor's report that they have a good idea of what would work best. And so this is the way we propose to get from meeting 4 to the end. And I think that we have all the tools and capabilities to get there. And we've got a good team here that is working on the proposed solution documents for the initiatives that we have identified through our meetings to date, and even looking ahead to meeting 5 and 6, a few that we haven't heard of, we've captured as well, and are working along those lines. So if you'd advance to the next slide, I will share with you what the 3 proposed solution work groups would be. And then underneath them are the different things that we've heard in our task force meetings to date. So you'll see next to the name of it, which meeting this came out of. And then a few of them, we won't have enough time to actually have an expert or a speaker on. So where you see like the first one, is there more we can do with our college tuition savings program? You'll see it says solution summary. We won't have enough to have a speaker on that, but we will have a proposed solution, and that will be included in the considerations for those work groups. And so as you consider whether you want to share an idea or a proposed recommendation with us, we'll ask you to identify which work group that your recommendation would go into, so that we can make sure that we capture all of the input and, again, all the experience and ideas from all of you. So you can take a look at this now. We're also in the survey going to include this slide so that you can kind of ponder and give us the priority of which work group that you would like to be in. I will say that our team spent a lot of time putting the different proposals in different buckets, and there are many that would fit in all 3 buckets. So we spent a lot of time moving them from bucket 1 to bucket 3 to bucket 2, and we landed where we think is pretty good. We also wanted to try and space them out so that each work group had enough, a semi-equal amount of initiatives to consider. And some of these are, I would say all lines are not equal. Some are very big. When you look at like at the bottom of government, under government, public and private institution, where you see a refinancing authority, that is a huge undertaking versus, some of the other ones might be a lighter lift. So we realize that all proposals are not equal, but we tried to balance them out so that there is a semi-equal load within each of the proposed work groups. So I'll pause for a moment, and Michelle, if I've forgotten anything as our expert facilitator, if I've forgotten anything here, please feel free to add your comments, and also see if there are any questions on the process at this point.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, and in following all my notes, I don't see a thing that was missed. Any questions? Not seeing any questions coming in. So we certainly, if people, as we go through the discussion at the end, if you do think of any before we adjourn for the day, during the next steps, we can also entertain any questions that you may think of at that point in time or immediately following the break. So with that, we will go to break and we will come back at 12:05 for our break and begin our discussion. Please be ready to turn those cameras on and tune up those vocal cords so we can hear from everybody. And we'll talk about how we're going to raise our hands to hear everyone's voices today. So we'll see you back here at 12:05. We have about 1 minute left in our break. Welcome back, everyone, from our break. We will begin now with our discussion. Did anyone have any questions about the process that they wanted to put into the chat before we begin with our discussion questions?
Yeah, this is Masood. Can you hear me?
Yes, Masood, please.
Okay. Based on what I have heard so far, it seems like the loan process and all of those details at the federal level are so complicated and confusing to people. I'm wondering if some of these recommendations at some point, it may be advisable to share with our elected officials as well, to our senators. So they are aware of these concerns from our side as well to expedite and address those concerns.
Masood, that's a great recommendation, and we've captured in the work groups a bucket called advocacy at the federal level, and we too believe that there is great opportunity to do an advocacy report out to our elected officials at the federal level based on what our outcomes are. So great thought.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the group? All right, so we're going to move into our facilitated discussion where we have 3 questions we're going to pose one by one and try and hear some voices in relation to those questions today. And 2 different ways that we will try and call on people. If you have something, please either chat and say you'd like to comment, or I'm going to try and monitor the participant list. You can raise your hand. Regardless of which way you choose to be called upon to voice your thoughts, we want to hear your voices. If you do have any connection issues, I can read whatever your comment is through the chat, but we do want to try and hear from people and see people today if your connection is working, so you can have your video on as well. I will be taking down the slides from time to time so we can see all the members through the WebEx, and you can change your view that way to do that as well, depending upon how you arrange your tiles. So to raise your hand in the participant, you would go over to your name and be able to see a little hand and click on it, and then you'd be raising your hand to be called upon. Again, we have a long list, so I will be monitoring for hands over there, otherwise the chat feature. All right, so those are our logistics. Now to our first question that we want to hear from people on is, based on what you have heard from the various presenters, what solutions do you believe could address the disparate impact student debt has on vulnerable communities, and why? And some examples we just put down there for thought is the Borrower Bill of Rights, the Ombudsman, licensure. There may be many others that you can think of, but we want to hear your thoughts as it relates to what the various presenters have provided to us. What do you believe could address the disparate impact student debt has on vulnerable communities and why? So with that, I open the table up to the task force members to see who would like to go ahead and comment and provide their thoughts first. Go ahead, Karen Bauer.
So this kind of covers both questions 1 and 2, which would be to consider an increase in civil legal services funding, positions specifically earmarked to provide assistance to student loan borrowers. And the borrowers that I'm thinking of are the ones mentioned in my own presentation, those people who are on Social Security, who need those disability discharges, but also for litigation purposes. As part of my current job, I'm very fortunate that they let me do that, but funding is really important for that purpose. And the reason that I think it's important is that people are used to going there already, right? Low income folks are used to going to legal action, legal aid, and judicare for these problems. So by housing at least some advocacy there, we could meet them where they're already at.
Thank you for that. Other comments? Who would like to share next? All right. Other task force members. Laura Sutherland, go ahead.
I wasn't sure if I was using the raise your hand function correctly. So I'm going to follow up a little bit on what Karen was saying. I think that getting some more data points as well. I think that on vulnerable communities. So for instance, if we were to have an ombudsman or BBOR, a Borrower Bill of Rights housed in a particular agency, being able to really collect data on how these communities are already being affected and be able to formulate policies based on concrete data. I think one of the things we heard from both Geneva's presentation as well as I believe the initial presentation was that we just don't have enough information on the impact of certain borrowers. I know someone in the first work group that I worked in reflected on how there's virtually no information on the impact on tribal communities. So it'd be nice to both have these resources, but also do some more data collection on that front.
Thank you, Laura. Paul Kunder, see your hand is raised.
Also accounts for a disproportionate share of troubled student loans. And I believe we also heard that this statistic is even more true for students of color. So I'm wondering if there's an opportunity for better oversight of for-profit schools or consumer protections for students that are considering attending or have attended a for-profit school.
All right. Any other comments, thoughts, or responses to the comments that you've heard?
This is Masood.
Go ahead, Masood.
Yeah, I was just wondering if we can also reach out to some organizations or associations that represent some of these minorities, and the number of those, whether it's African American or Latino or other types of groups that are adversely affected, because they also have quite a bit of data that how these other guys in their communities have been impacted. So
thank you for that. I also see that Kimani had a comment here that I will read. Education is important, therefore having a resource that could assist borrowers with critical processes is a solution. It will be critical for the disparate communities to know they exist. This is critical to minimize the negative impacts. For example, the ombudsman option is viable. And then Renee, gosh, did you want to comment regarding your response? Oh,
more data, especially around the grants that we're giving out to students and what the demographic information are of the students receiving grants.
Great, thank you. And Michael Rosen.
Am I unmuted? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the Bill of Rights and the Ombudsman are both good ideas. I especially want to talk about the for-profits. In the Great Recession, there was a tsunami of for-profits that descended on the city of Milwaukee, Everest College, ITT Tech, the Art Institute. All three of them went belly up. The testimony we heard from Karen was right on spot on. The students, we're talking thousands of students, were left in a lurch with nothing but debt. And so I think regulations in the city, we got passed an ordinance that imposed some of the Obama era regulations on for-profits that we're trying to set up in the city. I'm not going to go into the details here, but I think that and it wouldn't be exactly applicable at the state level, but I think we should explore something like that, as well as the education. I don't know what's happened with the Education Accountability Board. I think that that's been revived. And if it has, we could talk about how to strengthen that from if it has been revived. And then the last thing I just wanted to mention is, given how low interest rates are right now, the possibility of some kind of state refinancing entity that would allow students to refinance their loans at significantly lower interest rates than they are currently paying.
Thank you. And I see Derek Campbell has raised his hand, and then after that, we'll go to Jeff Brent.
Hi, so I guess one thing that I was thinking was a little bit more on the front end aspect, and specifically that information piece, and making sure that the correct information is not only available for students, but we're really examining how it's getting to students. And when I think about that, I think especially for first-time college students, like myself, and as Karen mentioned earlier, while that information may be out there, it really can be a heavy lift for someone who has no resources or no one to lean on to go to find that information. I know that information is out there, but I think it would be important for us to kind of take a look and see, re-examine how we're making sure that those students who really need it are getting that information.
Thank you. And Jeff?
Derek stole my first one. That was the idea of more advising and more engagement up front with borrowers, potential borrowers and students, making sure they understand their options clearly and they understand the fiscal impact. We've talked about that before, but that could be a system-wide or a statewide initiative, but it costs money to hire advisors. And this is a really important opportunity to save students on the back end with a little more treatment on the front end. The other one is a kind of a generic one, but I mean, the unmet need that students face continues to be there, and it grows even while tuition is frozen at the public institutions. So greater financial aid, just a greater investment in financial aid to help meet that unmet need is a straightforward way to help potentially reduce student loan debt moving forward. And we have been traditionally a low aid, low tuition state, and that's worked for a lot of ways, but if you really want to get at it, a low tuition, high aid state is probably a better strategy to reduce student debt moving forward.
Thank you. And then Jamie Miller, and then we'll go back to Renee Gesh again.
Thank you. I think working perhaps with the State Bar of Wisconsin and creating a pro bono task force or system where we have lawyers in the state that are willing to volunteer specifically to help people negotiate student loans, IBRs, and that type of thing. I think the same thing could be said about creating something with our law schools, Marquette and Wisconsin, and create student-run programs to help navigate through the IBR process. As a bankruptcy lawyer, I see many clients that have the capability of getting student loans discharged through the bankruptcy process. And we do several of those pro bono, but we can only do so many of those. It's a very expensive process. And if there's a way either through a pro bono program or using law school students to help people discharge student loans in bankruptcy, I think that would be time well spent.
Thank you. And Renee, did you go ahead?
Yeah, I'm thinking especially about those students who are first generation college students. And I think more funding for counselors in those schools where there's a high number of first generation college students could go a long way into really helping students think about financing college on the front end. So as we enter this next budget process, how could we allocate more resources for counselors in high schools, especially in low-income rural and urban areas, or schools with a high number of students of color or a high number of first-generation students, college students.
Thank you for that thought. And the final comment we'll take on this question is Rebecca Larson.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to just build on Jeff's comments, agree with the student financial aid. And just recently, earlier this month in the Senate Help Committee, they discussed doubling the Pell Grant, particularly because of the health pandemic and knowing that the financial situation of a lot of students and families have changed. So, maybe consider something similar for the state of Wisconsin in terms of Wisconsin grant, a doubling of the Wisconsin grant or some type of increase.
Thank you for that. And thank you to everyone for contributing and responding with their thoughts on that question. As I set up the second question, if you've raised your hand for the first question, please lower it by clicking on the little hand raising thing again, and that will lower your hand unless you are ready for question 2. So what programs are you aware of or familiar with that we've not yet discussed? And these could be happening within your organization, community, or other states. But this is an opportunity to start hearing about some of the other programs that are out there that we may not have time to have full presenters on, but it would be a highlight into a topic or recommendation paper that you may write. So we will go ahead, and I see Jamie Miller that you have your hand raised, so we'll let you be first to comment on this.
I'm so sorry, I must have left my hand raised from last time. I apologize.
No, that is fine. So sorry for calling you out on that.
No problem.
All right. Anyone have any thoughts or ideas as it relates to what programs are you aware of or familiar with that we've not yet discussed? You don't have to have a lot of detail on it. It could just be food for thought here. An example of something you might be working on piloting back at your organization or just heard about in passing with other colleagues. All right, go ahead, Paul.
Program to reference, although I know there are a number of them taking place, but one of the things that we've heard about that I think is a significant issue is non-completion of degree programs. A significant portion of troubled student debt are smaller balances from those that accumulated debt in the first year of schooling and they didn't complete for any number of reasons, but that sticks with them and they don't have the higher earning power that the skilled job would have provided them. So programs around student success and completion, especially the first year, or programs around helping people not avoid the need to borrow in that first year, I think would go a long way to helping relieve a troubled student debt on the back end.
All right. Thank you for sharing that. And Kevin McShane.
Hi, I wanted to share something that we do at Herzing University. We actually have a team of employees. There's 4 employees and a manager, so a team of 5 total employees. And they assist anybody who has attended Herzing University with managing their student loan repayment. So they will primarily, and again, we could talk about it for a long time, but primarily they're spending a lot of time doing 3-way calls with servicers and staying on and being an advocate for that student. So I would really push that we continue to consider things like a true student advocacy group, not just from an accountability or ombudsman perspective, but really providing resources for somebody to walk you through all those complexities and assist students with that, because it's been very successful and very well regarded by our students, and they really appreciate that assistance that they can specifically receive from somebody advocating for them that's not working for one of these other companies.
Thank you. And Jeff Brent.
It's a couple of things we were looking at system in terms of, in particular, teacher shortage that we're facing as a state, and trying to find some really direct ways to increase interest in becoming a teacher and making it more financially viable. One way was looking at, because teachers graduate with debt and yet their starting salaries are relatively low across the state. So we can't affect the back end of that, but could we do something on the front end? And I think this could be extrapolated to other lower income fields that require college degrees that, you're kind of caught in a catch-22 there. So we've looked at trying to find ways to make the last semester tuition free, especially if they're student teaching, or looking at creating like a broader incentive program where after 5 years in the field, we'll pay off half your debt or 3/4 of your debt or a couple $1,000s towards debt a year. Just trying to find some targeted ways to really look at specific fields that are struggling rather than because the big issue is hard to get at. But if we can find a way to find debt relief for some specific fields of study, you might actually increase the number of people who go into those fields of study. So using it as a bit of an incentive in those cases.
Thank you for sharing that. And Kevin, I'm going to circle back to you because Karen has a question and wants to hear more. Have default rates at Herzing gone down as a result of the program that you mentioned? If you could tell us more.
Yeah, great question. It saves me the typing. I was trying to type a response. So I appreciate the question. I want to answer in 2 parts. Simply the answer is yes. But I also want to say that default rates are not always the best measure on success of a program. Default rates, your default rate will improve through things like deferment and forbearance, but that's not always the best situation for a student. Our program is really designed to first and foremost get a student in the best payment plan for them. So if they get into a quality payment plan that works for their life and helps them repay down that debt, far better than a forbearance, as many examples we've had over the course of this task force have explained to us. So yes, the default rates are better, but I don't really think that's what makes the program successful. I think it's that we have a lot of students that are in much better repayment situations than if they had not worked with us, and I think that's really the true measure of success.
Thank you. And it looks like Alex Shade, you may have a comment in relation to what Kevin shared.
Yeah, one of the things I think that we also have to loop back into is we've heard from various individuals over the course of the past 3 meetings talking about the lack of sensitivity and or I'm just going to say also cultural competency when it comes to individuals having phoned in and asking for assistance for either navigating through the check-in process, or if they have their loans and getting various types of updates and not receiving the right information. So regardless, individuals that are working with individuals who are carrying loan balances and receive constant updates that may be confusing, or one may come out of this side of the mouth, the other one comes out of this side of the mouth. We also need to address those two things of just, again, more cultural competency and awareness, both on the member call center side of things, and then also recognizing, right, not everybody looks like the majority, and being very sensitive to that. The other piece of that is the communications component of it. We had heard from several individuals talking about how the communication that they received was it wasn't consistent with previous communication that was relayed to them. So whether that's coming from a data analysis standpoint of looking at encoding and being able to go back in and seeing an actual schedule similar to what billing departments have to look at, okay, here was the record related to where this individual's address was. So confirming address, email, telephone number, cell phone number, and also making sure from a record keeping purpose that is also up to date, it's current, and us proposing recommendations in the communication space as well.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And then Sylvie, it looks like you also had a comment.
I did. So I was just agreeing with Jeff and his proposition. So currently a student at UW-Milwaukee, I'm closing in on my final term and I'm about to be student teaching myself. Technically, I do call it the unpaid internship. As wonderful, as enjoyable as it is, you're not paid for student teaching because it is part of your curriculum and before you graduate. So if there is a possibility in the making to have that, like I said, alleviated or waived, or I mean, of course, they'll pay seg fees, but maybe have the tuition recalculated on that point, I believe that would be, as I said, extremely beneficial to student teachers coming in. And that's from all teachers or future educators in the UW system, because they're coming with that same package from graduation. So if that's something that's in the works, or if that's a possibility even to work with the Board of Regents or something to have implemented policy-wise for the UW schools or certain schools, that's something I would definitely look forward to, or be willing to work with anyone or Jeff if there is a type of a force in the way for making that, yes.
Thank you for sharing. And then Secretary Blumenfeld, and then we will go to Jamie.
Thank you. Karen, in your discussion today, you talked about being an independent student and you were not able to complete the FAFSA. And as I recall from our first and second meetings, our FAFSA completion rate in the state of Wisconsin is very low. And I'm wondering if there isn't a whole population there that we could formulate a strategy around to help those independent students get some kind of aid that is outside of the FAFSA program. And I don't know if anything like that exists. I guess I'd open that question up to the group if anyone has information around that. But it seems like that is a, given the fact that they don't have access to the grant dollars, that they probably likely qualify for them, and that they probably, many of those people end up in a higher debt situation or potentially a non-completion situation. Is there a strategy that anyone is aware of, or that we could formulate around those independent, I'll call them independents, I think that's the term you use, Karen, independent students?
Thank you. Jamie Miller, did you want to comment?
Sure. Again, not to be so bankruptcy focused, but dischargeability of student loans in the bankruptcy court is a viable option for many. It's just that the process is so complex and pricey. The Southern District of New York Bankruptcy Court has implemented a student loan mediation program that I hear from colleagues is very successful. It allows debtors and their counsel to have a mediator appointed, which is often a lawyer from the community that will work pre-litigation with the student loan companies to try to negotiate either discharges of student loans or better repayment plans. That mediation program also will enter into, it will help students understand what their options are with IDR and IBR. So it's a great tool. I know the bankruptcy court for the Eastern District of Wisconsin is currently working on a similar program currently.
Thank you. And Karen, I see you had a comment in response to Jamie, and if you wanted to follow up with anything that the secretary indicated as well.
Sure. I think I'm familiar with the program that Jamie is talking about, and I attended an information session on it and found it to be very expensive for debtors, especially for my client base, who are all very low income people. None of them would be able to afford it, and the program kind of foreclosed some relief in bankruptcy court if you couldn't afford it. So maybe with some tweaks that would work, but I loved hearing that Kathy kind of heard my comments about true independent students. You know, the issue there is that in order to become an independent student for FAFSA purposes, you have to be married or have a child or be a former foster child or a veteran. And if you can't check all of those boxes, you just cannot get any federal financial aid. So if we could figure out a way to bridge that gap for some Wisconsin students, that would be wonderful. I don't think that my situation was unique at all.
Thank you for sharing that. And then Jeff Brandt, it looks like you were trying to respond and provide more information in relation to Sylvie's comment. Do you want to share?
Just pointing out that we've looked at a couple different options for that, including maybe a grant program to cover that last year or the bulk of the last year, or increasing the stipend that students get for student teaching, but just either remitting tuition for that last semester seems the cleanest. Then I think politically we might have more opportunity with that. With everything going on, it's kind of fallen off the radar a little bit, but we still have a team working on it, and we hope to have some ideas as part of our budget when we introduce it later this summer.
Thank you. And any final sharing as it relates to programs that you're aware of or familiar with that we've not yet discussed? Again, these could be within your organization, community, or other states. We have any other? Brandon Trujillo.
Thank you. So I have a thought about, you know, a lot of the ideas, and it's to echo what Jeff and Rebecca mentioned, is that, you know, we're always looking for additional funding for Wisconsin grants and just additional support for needy students. And I don't know if we could come up with a way to create a trust or something to help with additional funding to assist in the GPR funding that's going into some of those programs. But another possible program that maybe we could create could kind of look like the veteran loan program that was created several years ago. And I don't know if it's still, I believe it's not active anymore, but maybe a way to create some sort of funding. And if the state's in the business of doing that and assisting students, it would maybe be a better way for us to provide some of that assistance. So just a thought, because we're always looking for additional revenue.
Thank you. And Sylvie, I see your hand is raised. Did you have an additional comment?
I did, yeah. And I think this might go a little bit more into like question one, but I figured as I recalled, I might as well just say it. So for our aid office at UWM, our advisors like to go and do what is called kind of like a financial aid day to most of the high schools within our scope surrounding UWM. So they visit most of the high schools and kind of take over or help facilitate what the counselors do. So you can hear straight from a financial aid advisor's own mouth about the proceedings of financial aid, literacy, budgeting, and what it comes to after becoming a high school graduate and how you want to continue on to further education. I'm not aware completely if other UW schools, other schools in general, if they do this, but to kind of help even more facilitate the process, if more universities kind of take hold and act on their own accountability, that you want students to come to higher education, you want them to be aware, of course, but I think it helps to take the initiative to get out there, visit high schools, visit high schoolers, students, and get them to the understanding or the information that they need coming directly from the source. Because at times it might not always be viable to have counselors if they don't have the resources, if they don't have the full know-how. It might be better just to have a visitor from the source come in and visit high school classrooms or other schools, whatever may need be, and get that initiative going and get them in there. Because if they are coming in with the information and the sources that they have, then it might help remove that overwhelming, intimidating process of, okay, how do I go into higher education now? What do I do next? If they feel they have a good grounding from the information that was given to them, even pre-high school graduation. I feel a lot of juniors, seniors especially, I think that would help facilitate the process a lot just by coming in and talking to them.
Thank you for sharing, and we'll take final comments on this question and move to our third. So Masood, if you'd like to go first, and then Kevin McShane.
Challenges associated with this debt financing, but it may not be a bad idea to find some success stories about people who borrowed the money, paid this thing back, and what they were able to do and how they did it. So we can get their input as well as a part of success story moving forward. The second part is, I think there's still about 10 to 15% of the debt that comes from those adults and seniors who go to school, they want to get graduation and not able to afford, and all of a sudden something happens, their car breaks down or something, they won't be able to pay. What they do is they just not pay the loan, go back and get a job and take care of those things. So it could be something that we want to hear from that group, or maybe in an organization that represents them. Would be good to capture those thoughts as well from that group.
Thank you for sharing. And Kevin?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, and I included a link in the chat if people are interested in looking into it. The U.S. Department of Education recently approved an experimental sites initiative that actually uses federal work study dollars to or allows students to earn federal work study dollars in kind of an internship, externship type experience. It's a bit more complicated than that, but for the sake of time, you could look at that, and that could be something potentially to be considered for some of those challenges that people are describing in how to pay in semesters where you're unable to work a separate job and things because of those requirements. So it might be worth people taking a look at if they haven't heard of that experiment.
Thank you very much. And so we will move to our third question. If people want to clear their hand their raised hands again, unless they are ready for question 3, which is, what do you think is the most critical thing the task force could do to address the student debt crisis for Wisconsin borrowers? Repeating the question, what do you think is the most critical thing the task force could do to address the student debt crisis for Wisconsin borrowers? And anyone has? All right, Michael Madursky.
Thanks. One thing, seems there's a lot of things, unfortunately. To me, there's got to be two things we got to break it down to. One is before they even get the debt, there has to be that education beforehand. I really like Kevin's idea of, talking to them and even being an advocate for them as they're going through the process. Having some sort of function there, I think, would be beneficial, so they just understand, so students understand what they're getting into in terms of the student debt. issue. And then, obviously those that do have student debt, what are we going to solve for them? I think it's a myriad of things. Again, advocacy is one. And one other point I wanted to make before on the high school side, Sylvie, I've attended some of those meetings with my kids. It's a high overview of the student of the debt process and the financial aid process. I think it has to be individual. Each individual has their own set of circumstances. So I think that would help. But then again, from the people that do have debt and how to help work through that, again, I think advocacy is another situation where somebody can be on the phone with them, working with these servicers and understanding the situations and trying to get into the best situation that they can.
Thank you for sharing those ideas. Secretary Blumenfeld, did you have a comment?
A leftover hand raise, sorry.
Okay, very well. All right, but Austin Hammond, I see your hand went up.
Yeah, and I apologize about not having the video on. The last time I did it, it froze and I had to reset the computer. So this will probably be easier having connectivity issues. But I would like to echo the point of like the financial literacy at a younger stage, just having like the information more accessible to students early on so they know what they're getting themselves into and explained in an easier way. So whether you'd integrate that by having somebody come in to various high schools to explain it, or have it like part of like high school curriculum where it's like maybe integrated into a class in such a way so they learn about it more frequently. But I think the other thing, thinking back to the tour that the governor did around the state, the listening session, is I think there's a lot of uncertainty of like feeling that there's consumer protection. So I just like kind of like want to loop around to like that borrower bill of right, just to know that the state has your back, and that or an advisory board, or someone mentioned earlier, and I know I'm kind of mentioning a few different things here that all have their own separate purpose, but someone discussed I lost my thought, and I'll come back to it, I apologize, but just students to feel like they're being protected by the state and they know that what they're getting themselves into is a good investment, because higher education is a huge investment. It's a really important one, but just to have that more clarity that there is protection from them, so they're not being kicked around, and simple things like, I think it was the last meeting and it was the state treasurer from Rhode Island, but like the emails of updates of where you are at and you're paying off your debt, so you don't have to like go through this chase of getting that information, just so there's like systems in place so you know what to expect. So in that long-winded answer, I think financial literacy earlier on, and also like consumer protection for Wisconsin students.
Thank you. It sounds like what I'm hearing might be a multi-pronged approach from what you were trying to describe. Laura Sutherland.
Thanks. I wanted to sort of comment on the education piece. I think one of the challenges of this question is that there's two pieces. There's the front end, taking on the debt, and then there's the mountain of debt that's already out there that we need to address. And a lot of predatory practices around that debt, both while in school and then after school. So it really speaks to the need for sort of a robust regulatory framework, both to get education to the borrowers about how to protect themselves and resources. But also there's a need to educate the public. And I don't know if it's the most important thing of this task force, but when I hear discussions about educating borrowers, I think it's very important. But the reality is you can be highly educated and it's still very difficult to pay for school, to find a job after school, to deal with this amount of debt, to navigate the processes that we've set up to pay it back. And so while as a consumer protection advocate in my previous life, I focus a lot on, I appreciate the ideas of disclosure. I think there needs to be a fair amount of education for the public in general about seeing ourselves in one another's plight, and the importance of seeing that the debt of the debt that is being shouldered by Wisconsin student borrowers is a community debt that we need to think about in terms of how it affects our economy, how it affects our community, and how it affects the people that we, are educating and living with, and that whole, the whole spectrum. So in any event, I think education is important both for the borrower, but also for the community at large to understand this greater problem.
Thanks for sharing those thoughts, Lara. And I see Renee Gesh's hand is up.
Yeah, echo everything that has been said. I also wanted to add, I'd love to explore what addressing the interest rates that students are paying would look like. I think people are paying too high of interest rates, and the amount of interest on their student loans that they're paying is far outweighs the value of the actual loan itself. So what would a interest rate reduction plan look like? Could students refinance through the state at an interest rate lower than 6.5%, which is kind of the average of what people are paying? What would a 4% interest rate plan program look like? And then how can we make more education programs free? I think that is maybe an obvious point here, but can we make two-year colleges free for students? Where can we inject more funds into the education system so that students aren't having to take on the amount of debt that they're taking?
Thank you for those thoughts. Larry Graves, you have your hand raised.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So I'd like to echo what Laura was just talking about in terms of education and this. It seems like we tend to focus in this country of the 4-year degree, a bachelor's degree, but I would like to focus on it takes all sorts to make our economy run. And honestly, in my job, I see a number of students, and Brandon can talk about this with his work in the Wisconsin Tech College system. We need plumbers, we need electricians, we need people in the trades, and those are not long-term investments in terms of an education, but I tell you, the salaries coming out of those programs is amazing. And I'm talking as someone who has, as a veteran who's completed, a master's degree, these people coming out of that these salaries are phenomenal. And I encourage, many people as I'm talking with folks about school, higher ed, to look at these, and because we know, higher education and the more degrees doesn't necessarily always equate to the higher pay. And we need to look at it as a whole and to, I think educating, especially first gen students of these programs, these careers and the earning potentials, and how, if you want to stay local in your community, this is a way to receive, to get an education, come back, live in your community, and to be an active member. If someone needs a plumber on the weekend, hey, you're there. If someone, home building and all this stuff, it all contributes back. And I think, again, we focus a lot about 4-year degrees, but man, there's lots of potentials with, those lesser credentials.
Thanks for sharing that. And I see that Mushad, you have your hand raised.
So one of the things I was thinking about, Wisconsin is a manufacturing state, and there is a shortage of workforce development quite a bit. I hear that all the time when I deal with CEOs, and it's not just Wisconsin, but nationally and internationally. I think there is a role for them to play in terms of what they can do, because we are addressing their concerns, both at the 2-year associate degree and also the 4-year degree. So I think we need to find a way to connect with those people to see what role they can play to address this, because we will be the resource for them for future opportunities.
Thank you. Connie Hutchinson, did you want to make a comment? not hearing her, but I know she has indicated that we are lucky to have the technical college system we have in Wisconsin, and all these opportunities must be provided to students, 2-year, 4-year, public and private nonprofit.
Can
So
you hear me, Michelle?
there you go.
Okay,
Thank
so
you.
I do want to point out that I know that when the financial aid and the financial aid association, when their members go out and talk to the high school counselors, and when I've done meetings in schools, I point out that we have all of these opportunities and there is aid available in some circumstances for the most needy students. And I think it's really important that we make sure that everybody understands that we're not, even with the task force and talking about student debt, we're not just talking about 4-year schools. And I think it's a really good point to ensure that, you know, we're talking about encouraging students to take advantages of the many opportunities we have here. So good job, Masood, and thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you, Connie. And I just want to mention that Michael Rosen did also share a link regarding an article on the Milwaukee ordinance regulating for-profits in the chat section of our WebEx meeting here. I want to thank, I don't see any other hands raised at this
Michelle,
point.
I think Michael Rosen has his hand up too.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry if I missed that. Michael?
Yeah, I appreciate the comments people made about the technical college, having taught at Milwaukee Area Technical College for 29 years and now running a nonprofit that serves technical college students. But I hope people are aware that student debt issues are major debt issues for technical college students as well. It's not technical colleges, especially in the city of Milwaukee at MATC, where the majority of students are low income and students of color. They're accruing significant debt attending college. The program that I wanted to mention, and I'll just throw it out, is, and I think it was Lori kind of alluded to it, is several states have set up promise programs, free tuition programs. Sometimes they start at the community college or technical college level. Some of them have expanded it to state universities as well. And I think we should look at those to see how they were financed. I know they're generally a last dollar program, but they are significant programs in terms of reducing the reliance on loans. And I think that would be something for us to try to evaluate.
Thank you, Michael. And Lucy Fensel, you've chatted in. Do you want to lend voice to that chat?
Sure, I can. After hearing Karen's story, I just was, it brought up a story of a student that came to me, and the process was so cumbersome for her in figuring out how she needs to repay her loans that there is no way she would have been going online every single day like Karen does. There's no way that she doesn't have internet out at her house. So there's so many different things that cause problems for her that she basically will probably just give up and go into default. And that's what I hear from a lot of other students, that they just give up.
Thank you for sharing that information for everyone. And with that, we will take one last comment here before we move on to our next meeting information. And Alex Shade.
So the other thing that clearly we continue to see is the racial disparities that exist within certain pockets within the community. Two thoughts, radical idea, right? Just loan forgiveness, that would be amazing. The second thing is looking at targeted zip codes where it's heavy concentrations of our brown and black communities in the space of looking at additional partnerships and collaborations with community-based organizations and other advocacy groups in addition to high schools that are helping to better and best connect the dots, not just for the students, but also for the family itself. We have to remember that, you know, I was looking at the FAFSA application again for the 2020-21 year, and I started getting anxiety. And it brought back some unforgotten, or I should say forgotten moments of anxiety. And sitting down at the dining room table with my parents and trying to collect all of their income statements and everything else. We have to remember that in some households, some of those may be non-traditional in the sense that it may not be the parent. It could be the aunt, the uncle, the grandmother, the grandparent. It could be the individual, him, her, themselves. And so working with other organizations, whether it be community-based organizations, the Urban League, local chapters of the NAACP, various congregations, there are sub-communities within communities that are taking it upon themselves because we are not providing the resources and or from a communications perspective, making it easy to find and to assist them in their completion of either the FAFSA and or to understanding that community colleges are a fantastic first route before taking on or pursuing. And I appreciate the comments related to vocational and trade school. You can come out of those programs as a master electrician, as a master plumber, you know, making a high six-figure salary. And again, micro and entrepreneurial business is another pathway, right? And so it's connecting those dots related to better collaboration and communication in this space.
Just fabulous thoughts and conversation today, and I wish we had more time on our agenda, but because we wanted to hear as many voices as we could, I want to read this one last comment from a voice we hadn't heard yet today. Marisha Harris, as she has background noise interference, so she put her thoughts down on paper here, and they are high-level thoughts, as she indicated. In the chat. So while I agree with more debt education needs to take place on the front end, I also believe that education puts the responsibility on the borrower. Note, I believe borrowers do have responsibility, no doubt. However, as a state, I believe we have a responsibility to make college more affordable as well, so that borrowing is not needed at the level at which borrowing is taking place now. I believe it's important for us to also consider the intergenerational impact of poverty on student debt. What proportion of students who live in poverty are leveraging student loan debt to cover living expenses while attending school? This is important as we look at affordability, not just tuition costs, but opportunity costs as well. So with that, again, I thank everyone for your participation in our discussion today, and knowing that this could go on longer, but we don't have time for that. Take this work to your work groups, and start thinking about that. Take your ideas and consider a solution proposal. Again, we'll want that intent by July 1. So with that, we have the next meeting on July 8th. Again, WebEx from 10 to 1. If you have questions, please contact the Student Debt Task Force at dfi.wisconsin.gov or go to our website for any of the PowerPoints or additional information there. And feedback in relation to the logistics of our meetings, please feel free to reach out to me. But again, you will be getting an email in short form here in the next day or two. Be watching for that because it is an action email. We will want you to fill out that survey and respond to us regarding any intent to provide a solution proposal to us. So we want to be hearing from everyone in selecting your work group and prioritizing that information there. So with that, all the reminders and next meeting information out there, I will turn it over to the secretary for final comments and adjournment.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you to all of you. What a great discussion today. It was so wonderful to hear all of your voices and your ideas and also to read your comments. There's some advantages to having this virtual format because we can hear from so many of you through the different channels at the same time. And I love how you support each other and add on. And it's really quite wonderful to see. I just want to encourage all of you. We heard a lot of wonderful ideas today to really take hold of one or even two or however many you have the bandwidth for. But this is where we really need you. We need you to roll up your sleeves and really consider the proposals that we have out there for you. And where you feel passionate about something and that is not on the list, or you want to even put an exclamation point next to something, we would really love for you to complete a proposed solution recommendation. And again, it's not a huge lift, it's 1 to 2 pages, but it'll really help out, round out the considerations and initiatives and that body of knowledge that we're trying to put together, because you all offered some really wonderful ideas. So please consider doing that and look for the survey that will come out, and please respond. And the sooner you can get those proposals in, the better it will be for all of us. I really look forward to our next meeting and look forward to hearing from all of you. So thank you again. I know a 3-hour meeting isn't always easy to sit through, but you guys are staying very engaged and I'm so appreciative of it. So take care, everyone, and be well. Bye-bye.